Surely, at this point, you've seen Imperial Yeast's amazing selection of high-quality brewing yeasts over at imperialyeast.com. But you might not be as familiar with Imperial Yeast's special order yeast bank. In addition to their tried-and-true core strain selection, Imperial Yeast has a number of ale or lager strains, Brettanomyces, Kveik, and other yeasts available for special order. If you're looking to match a yeast strain currently in production, or just looking for something new to play with in the brew house, reach out to Imperial Yeast customer service to see what they may have in store. Special order strains are subject to a 10-liter order minimum and require a 2 to 3 week propagation time, but they might just be what you're looking for your next brew. You can get more information about Imperial Yeast's special order strains by calling 503-477-5826 or emailing customerservice@imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Beer has been brewed for thousands of years, so long that many historians believe fermentation and cultivation of cereal grains might have been the competitive advantage that humans needed to survive early hostile environments. But throughout history, beer has been with us, so pervasive in fact that some people don't even recognize its influence. I'm your host, K. Joe, but today in the lab I'm speaking with Jonny Garrett, author of the upcoming book, The Meaning of Beer, How Our Pursuit of the Perfect Pint Built the World. From ancient Mesopotamia to the taps at your local bar or pub, beer has been there, and it's actually influenced many of the major events that spurred humanity forward. I'm talking engineering advances, foundational microbiology, and today even studying how genetic modifications impact living organisms, and those are just the science-related impacts. How about sports, culture, music, politics? Remember that guy named Sam Adams? Yeah, he was kind of important, and he makes a pretty darn good beer. Or even from a darker and more European perspective, that guy named Adolf Hitler. He started his career by speaking in German beer halls, which is discussed in the book. Beer has been a part of some of the biggest events in human history, but it's also one of our many daily ablutions. It's so common as to fade into the background, becoming a part of the fabric of life. So Jonny Garrett decided to write a book, not from a historical perspective, but from the perspective of beer. How beer influenced us, not how we influenced beer. It's a new perspective and a fun read. So after a few words, we'll get into that interview with Jonny. If you haven't yet signed up to become a patron, please consider doing so. By becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, you get awesome rewards like access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3 a month, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. Becoming a patron is easy once you've contributed at that $3 level or higher. You'll get access to the private Patreon Facebook page where all of the previous Q&A sessions are available to watch. So guests like Vinny Chilurzo, John Palmer, Marshall Schott, and most recently, Dr. Scott LaFontaine from the University of Arkansas. There are so many more. All the information that you need to get access to this awesome resource is at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Thank you to everyone that's left a rating or review of the show. We're over 100 ratings on Apple Podcasts, which is awesome. Those ratings are really awesome. They let us know what you think about the show and provide feedback that we can use to make the show better. So if you haven't yet left a rating or review on your podcast service of choice, please take a moment, pause, and do that for us. Feedback this week is from listener Jim, who says, "Hi, Cade. Following up on episode 179, which is the episode on the hidden beers of Belgium. When I was there last, we spent most of our time in the French-speaking parts, and while most of the beer wasn't as great as the Dutch side, there's a cool brewery in Namur making some great beers. I highly recommend it. Their most famous is Hoop, which you can find kind of throughout the country, but I think it still qualifies as a hidden beer. It's kind of like a triple, but its character is certainly unique. I'm sure there are lots of other breweries that could make the list, but wanted to call out one that I liked while visiting." Hey, Jim, thanks for sending in the feedback. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm sure there are tons of hidden breweries out there, hidden beers out there in Belgium and probably in other countries as well, of course, that didn't make the list. And yeah, as Brendan mentioned, he had to narrow it down to 24 when there were hundreds that could have possibly made the list. But yeah, thank you for sending in the Brasserie de Namur. I'm butchering that, I know, which is the brewer of Hoop, Houppe. So yeah, thanks, Jim, for the feedback. All right, after this short break, I'll be back talking about the meaning of beer with Jonny Garrett. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com.
Got great ideas, but no idea how to build a website? Get Bluehost. Their AI design tool creates high-quality WordPress sites super fast. Whether you're a blogger, influencer, or launching a side hustle, Bluehost helps boost your growth with built-in marketing and e-commerce tools. Upgrade to cloud and get 100% uptime and 24/7 security to stay online all the time. Why wait? You've got the vision. Make it real. Visit Bluehost.com to get started.
How do you feel when you switch to Geico and save on your car insurance? It's like going to work on one Thursday morning and thinking to yourself, just one more day until Friday. But then somebody in the elevator says, "Happy Friday!" Then you check your phone quickly and discover today's actually Friday. So yes, happy Friday, random stranger in the elevator. Happy Friday indeed. Yep, switching and saving with Geico feels just like that. Get more with Geico.
Clearly, we love beer here at Brewlosophy. I mean, our name is a play on the philosophy of brewing, and this is, of course, the Brew Lab, where we focus mostly on brewing science. But occasionally, we get to pretend that we're not in a lab, but instead taking a trip through beer history and culture. And with me in the lab today is historical traveler, beer writer, multi-award-winning journalist, author, filmmaker, Jonny Garrett. And he's here to talk about his new book, The Meaning of Beer: How Our Pursuit of the Perfect Pint Built the World. Jonny, welcome to the Brew Lab.
Hey, as a Brewlosophy fan, it's an honor to be here.
Well, the honor is all ours. I mean, I didn't have enough room in the intro to list all of the other accolades, like, you know, all the different awards you've gotten for the different books you've written. By the way, this is your 4th book, so there are 3 other publications out there. And I think a lot of our listeners would recognize you as the co-creator of the Craft Beer channel on YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to say, but, you know, people ask me what my job is, and I get to say YouTuber and see that reaction, see that just sink in.
Yeah.
And then get to follow it up by saying, also, it's about beer, which often elicits a similar skeptical response.
Exactly. Like, oh, so you just drink a lot on your YouTube channel. No, I don't. That's great. Well, you know, Jonny, obviously, or at least it sounds like you're from England. And when I start thinking about folks from across the pond, and I start thinking about the meaning of life, I start, of course, thinking about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Monty Python's Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. How likely do you think it is that either of those were influenced by beer?
Well, I mean, I think if you've watched any Monty Python, you'd assume they were half cut for most of the filming. But I mean, Hitchhiker's Guide, you know, that almost pretty much starts in a pub, right? When Arthur's taken to to the pub by 4 prefects, and he's like, "You're going to need a couple of pints." And
Exactly.
I think that there's not many greater examples of the meaning of beer than the world's ending. Let's have some pints.
Exactly. I so appreciate that you got those references, because that's exactly where I was going with that. And yeah, I mean, what a great example, right? I mean, The Hitchhiker's Guide is one of the all-time classic sci-fi books, and it starts in a pint, or it starts over a pint in a bar, like you said, as the world is ending. And as we talk about the meaning of beer, of course, your new book, that just really resonates with me as something that is so important about the beverage that we love. But you know, before we wax poetic on that stuff, I do want to ask and do a little bit of intro of yourself. Now, I've already sort of mentioned Craft Beer channel, publisher, author, filmmaker. How did you become interested in writing specifically about beer?
Well, so I'm a writer by training, so I did a master's in magazine journalism. I did a degree in geography, wanted to be a weatherman, and then realized that I needed also a PhD in maths and other things. So I retrained, did magazine journalism, thought I'd be a music journalist. And I remember going to my first work placement at a magazine called Mojo. And the editorial assistant there, guy at the bottom of the chain, was 43. And I was like, okay.
Oh, wow.
Music journalism's out.
Yeah.
So I'd worked in pubs to fund university, and had really got into great car scales. How to look after them as well, I was pretty interested in. And so that was sort of a bubbling passion underneath. And I was watching people on YouTube a lot and enjoying people like Simon Martin, Rob from Hop Scene, Beer Geek Nation. Sadly, he sort of quit the game about 5 years ago. And it kind of came to a head. So I was working actually for Jamie Oliver, the chef. I was editing his website by the time I left Jamie's. And when he founded FoodTube, his YouTube channel, suddenly we had in our office the most incredible YouTube studio that you could possibly imagine, with the plenty of money that Jamie liked to invest in every passion that he had. And me and Brad, who I still host the channel with, just started messing around, making little video reviews, cooking with beer, doing little explainers. I mean, terrible stuff, let's be honest.
Nah.
Like, I cringe when I look back at the early videos. But, it got a bit of traction, I think, because we were getting out of the bedroom or the kitchen where people were reviewing. And so for a while, I was more of a broadcaster. I took that full time in 2018, but the magazine journalism, the writing never went away, and the books sort of came first, and then I started writing for things like Good Beer Hunting as well. Mm-hmm. And now it's about half of the job, writing books and articles and stuff like that, and using my degree, which not many people can get to claim.
No, exactly. I mean, that's fantastic. I certainly am not using my law degree while studying beer here in Oregon, or hosting a podcast for that matter. But that's really cool. It is true. I look back at some of the initial episodes of the Brew Lab, and I cringe as well. But I think I can speak for all of the people that are familiar with the Craft Brew channel that we are our own worst critics. Even those early episodes are still fantastic, and so what you're doing there is great. And of course, you have a new book out called The Meaning of Beer, and that's kind of the focus of this episode. So I wanted to start sort of generally by introducing the book, asking why you wanted to write it. And of course, I think, the first subheading of the book, explains the angle, right? It's not how we made beer, but how beer made us. Why write it from this angle?
I mean, there's a couple of reasons, a couple of inspirations for it. Probably the main one, and it's something that I've had for it's now about 12 years I've been writing and making films about beer, is the response that I get when people say, when I say to them I'm a beer writer or I have a YouTube channel about beer, and usually the response is that really a job? Yeah. And, I feel like I put this in the book, but like not many people have to justify their jobs, unless you're an arms dealer or something. So I got kind of sick and tired of justifying it, and the coupling that with the way that people treat beer. It's often, for most people, it's just on the shopping list next to the washing up liquid. It's just a prop for socializing and for drinking while you're watching the sport. And that's certainly how people see it, but I definitely never saw it that way. I always saw it as one of the most important rituals that we have in daily life, in modern life. And I couldn't quite understand why people didn't see it that way either. And, that started with, me getting into craft beer and tasting all these exciting flavors and not understanding why anybody would just want to drink macro lager. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it quickly moved on to even the people who just want to drink macro lager also going like, but there's significance to what you're drinking as well. Yeah. So it was, sort of an inner fury, I think, both beer and to some extent myself not being taken as seriously as perhaps I wanted to be taken. Yeah.
Oh man, I totally, that totally resonates with me, the not a real job thing. I remember telling everybody whenever I was, leaving my career as a lawyer and going, I'm going to go get a PhD in beer in brewing science. And everyone universally said, you can do that? Like that's
a viable path. Yeah, I don't know, but we're gonna find out.
Yeah, exactly. So the not a real job quote really resonates me. But you mentioned there how like ubiquitous beer is in society, and you're right that people often, it's just another item on the shopping list is how people think of it. But you mentioned getting into craft beer, but really it sounds like from the introduction of the book that something that also inspired you a lot was your father, right? That that he had his sort of, like you explained it, a daily ablution. He'd come home from work and have his beer, and that was a daily ritual. I certainly had a similar experience with my father growing up, and certainly other people that we were associated with. I mean, beer has always just been a part of the fabric of life for me, but it was macro lager, and it was way later in my life until somebody gave me a Mr. Beer homebrewing kit and said, hey, you like to cook, you like to drink craft beer, maybe this homebrewing thing would be something fun for you to do. And then here we go, right? And we're off to the races.
They didn't know what they were starting.
No.
I mean, the fascinating thing about that, the whole first chapter is about my dad's ritual and what that meant for me. And the most surprising thing is he doesn't really like beer. He's a wine lover and was quite serious about his wine. And yet when he finished work, it was never a glass of wine that he had. It was a bottle of beer. So, that definitely in my mind set this up as, beer isn't just an alcoholic drink. It's also a social marker, it's a political marker. It has so much more significance, to the point where people who don't really drink beer will still have a beer when they go to the pub, or still have a beer when they finish work, or whatever it is. And that really sort of instilled in me a real reverence for the sociological element of beer and the impact that it has had on humanity.
Yeah, totally. Right. I mean, just if something that is that ubiquitous, like in your daily life, I mean, another thing that sort of resonates with me too about like beer and just having that impact is there's this new resurgence here in the United States of the macro lager coming out from craft breweries, right? So craft breweries that, made their name in IPAs or, double IPAs or triple IPAs or New England or hazies or all these things are now making these light lagers, but they're doing it in the style that was really popular back in what I understand of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That was before I was born. But when you could just go into the supermarket and the can, there would just be a nondescript white can with black lettering on it, and it said beer. And that was it. And those were the options that you had in the craft beer aisle. I mean, of course, we go in now, and there's entire aisles devoted to all the different types and styles of beers that you can get. And there's an amazingly incredible beer culture. But it seems like not that long ago that, yes, beer was a part of our lives, but it just why doesn't it have the same significance as wine? Right? I just kind of
we explore this in the book, but I think its central place in society is actually its undoing, and that's why we've always underestimated it, because it has just become a commercialized inevitability. Whereas wine, particularly because it was attached to food, because it was generally at a higher price point, you would drink wine for special occasions, and so it therefore had this perceived extra value. And the same is true of I think of whiskey as well, which, let's be honest, the first half of making whiskey is making beer.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, beer, I think beer's sort of everyday kind of personality and approachability has been the reason why we don't look at it as a genuinely society shaping, civilization inspiring thing that I genuinely believe makes the invention of beer, or probably more broadly the understanding of fermentation, as big a leap for humanity as the discovery of fire.
Well, yeah, and I want to get to that too. I mean, the first chapter of your book after the introduction is about civilization, and how beer built our first cities and cultures. But one of the things, back on the introduction a little bit, and just talking generally about the book, one of the things I think that sets this book apart is that, yeah, this is a book about the meaning of beer, and so it's going to start off in some places that we may have heard of before, some places that we haven't. It's going to start off in ancient times and go all the way through modern times. But the thing that sets this book apart for me is that you actually went to and visited most of the places that you talk about in the book. So when you talk about something that was 3,000 years ago when beer was first made, you went there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that comes from the magazine training, which is very much, you can put yourself in the story if you think it adds value. And a lot of history around beer is written from primary sources, to be fair, but not from a personal perspective. It's not, this is how I experienced this. This is what it's like now. This is how it felt to be there. And I was really keen that if I was going to tell this history about a very personal product in beer, I'd want to experience it as well. And I'd also want to, I think maybe we'll get to this with sort of chapter 2 and the isolation of yeast and stuff like this. Like, these are stories that most beer geeks know, but very few writers and broadcasters have bothered to, go to Carlsberg and ask the questions and look at the artifacts and really understand it. Like, I knew that a guy called Emil Christian Hansen isolated yeast in the 1880s, but I didn't know what his role was at Carlsberg. I didn't know all the incredible facts that I now know about him and his absurd childhood that he lived, that led to him being this dogged, tireless man that, wanted to perhaps stick a finger up at Louis Pasteur. And understanding all of that stuff just brings this stuff to life and gives us better stories that, give beer the context that it needs and deserves.
Well, and it is, and there's such a grand scale, right? I mean, of course, we can look at the macro lagers and think of like the grand scale of brewing this day, but no, the grand scale of beer's impact on culture, and so being in these places where this history was made, right? I mean, Louis Pasteur and Emil Christian Hansen, those are foundational scientists, that discovered things that impact everything, right? I mean, these are real foundational topics. And the importance of that just can't be overstated, from a scientific perspective. But we're going to talk about science here in a little bit. I geek out a little bit thinking about being present in some of these places. I mean, there's so many things that are on my beer bucket list. Like you said, going to Carlsberg and being there. Going into ancient Egypt, like you did. Going out, even to some of the East Asian cultures, where beer was also influential in a way that we don't necessarily think of. At least, classically, or I would say historically Western countries don't really think about the impact that beer might have had in East Asia and around other parts of the world. And these are things that you all explored in the book. But before we get too far down that path, I did want to start with that civilization chapter. Again, how beer built our first cities and cultures. And this is one, I think this is a great example of, yes, some of these things are things that you've heard before, but experienced in a new way. And here's what you say in the book. You say, pretty much every beer book that has ever been written, and indeed ever will be written, contains some kind of reference to Mesopotamia, a thing called the Sumerian tablet, and a poem to the goddess Ninkasi. Usually it will follow it up with something about how pharaohs paid the people who built the pyramids in beer, and well, this book will be no different, save for the fact that I have now lived it. and
yeah, I mean, that was, I'm not gonna lie, that was a bit of a two fingers up, I think, to a lot of the sort of hack journalists that have written about this stuff in listicles for various websites. And I that was one of the major reasons that I wanted to go. And, without giving too much of a spoiler in the book, I go there to visit one of the oldest examples of commercial brewing in the world, and I get there and it's under 10 foot of sand and I can't actually see this ruin. Mm-hmm. But I kind of suspected that might be the case, and I still went because I still wanted to soak up this location, which is Abydos, which is, not a place that many people have heard of unless you're really into your ancient Egyptian history. It is in the absolute middle of nowhere. It took 4 hours to drive from Luxor. And although I couldn't see the actual brewery itself, I could see many of the things that the brewery built, including the pyramids of Giza. And I could see the cultural landscape that's built up around this. You can't talk about modern Egypt without talking about ancient Egypt, because when you walk around Luxor, you're tripping over temples and statues, and all of the people that live in Luxor pretty much are working in some kind of trade that is about that tourism element. And so I wanted to go there and experience it rather than doing the academic thing of just being at home and going, well, Abydos Brewery is this old and it was the blueprint for the pyramids. So I was like, no, I want to tell the people stories. And I didn't expect those stories to be me being sort of frog marched out into the desert by a man with an AK-47, but which the better for the book.
Which again, that's a great one for the book. Yeah. And if you listen to that going, wait, what? He did what? Yeah, you're going to need to read the book to get that story, which is fantastic. And also not to spoil anything from the book either, but one of the things that you get from being there, right, from being in this place where this commercial scale brewery was made is the size and scale, again. And so, again, not to overshare from the book, because I do want people to go out, purchase the book and read the book. But But one of the things that you mentioned there is it was hundreds, thousands of liters that were brewed at this specific location. And standing there, you sort of looking around going, okay, we've got this, equipment from brewing, and here's where the temple is and all this stuff. But there was something missing. And the thing that was missing is where are all of the cups? where are people drinking this beer, right? And you go like, why is that? And some interesting things came from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it all points to this, that whole chapter of civilization, it's about how, and this is written about all the time as well, how beer was food, it was safe water, and it had a huge sort of practical element, but it also had this incredible religious element because it was safe water, nutritional and delicious, and we didn't know how it was made.
Yeah,
that gave it a religious element immediately, and so it became this huge object of worship. It was used in funerals, it was used in births, it was used in dedications and sacrifices to various gods all over the world. But yeah, in ancient Egypt and in Abydos, which is sort of the original holy site and the original burial ground for the earliest kings, beer was at the absolute heart of every single ceremony that they had, which meant that they had a brewery the size of Fuller's Brewery in London, but nobody was drinking the beer because it was all being sacrificed.
Yeah, it's all just being dumped on the ground, for the pharaohs that are long gone, right? Which I'm like, oh God, it's a whole new meaning of pour one out,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just pour 1,000 liters out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I guess, pharaohs and all that stuff. I mean, maybe they need more beer in the afterlife, a lot more people to support. But, that was a really cool thing, right? And that's an experience that you get from being there, is like understanding like the sheer scale of this and the central impact that beer had in that ancient Egyptian religion. But then you go on to point out, it's not just ancient Egypt where beer was used. I mean, again, you've heard this thing called, this goddess called Ninkasi in Mesopotamia and the Sumerian tablet, and then you talk about that in the book. But then the other thing, too, that I think most, at least modern brewers would be familiar with, and, part of the subject of what I just talked about in my last podcast about beers in Belgium are Trappists, right? Those are monks that are still brewing beer, and the reason that they brew beer is so that they can do and comply with their religious tenets. I mean, hell, even as you point out, the city of Munich literally translates to, or at least maybe originally derived from, where the monks are, right?
Yeah.
And that's a famous beer city, and that's where the monks are.
Yeah, absolutely. This was one of the major takeaways from the book, was from the research for the book, was this fact that everywhere that you find Christianity, you find beer. And, we kind of associate it because Christianity sprung up in the eastern end of the Mediterranean. We generally think that it would be wine. All of the miracles that are talked about in the Bible are wine. But actually, beer was, the first references we have to beer is about 13,000 years ago in Israel, near Nazareth, a place called Rakafet Cave. And then as Christianity spread throughout Europe, all of the people that were practicing it were brewing. And so the Trappist monasteries aren't just this, this sort of this mad, I can't believe monks are brewing beer. What's that about? It's they've been doing it, for 3,000 or 4,000 years. 2,000 or 3,000 years, I should say. Yeah. And they have become sort of that final link to the incredible link between religion and beer, not just from the fact that they do it to survive and to thrive and to fund their way of life, but also because it's what they've always done. And all of the references that we have in sort of the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, all of the great discoveries and the formation of beer as we know it today, which is, barley, hops, water, yeast, come from monks and come from abbots and come from nuns and all kinds of religious kind of characters that were writing about it, because they were the people that could write. They were people that were brewing the beer mostly. And so all our information comes from them.
Yeah, exactly. And it is interesting because you talk about like wine being used, in religious ceremonies, especially for like Catholic religions and stuff, like wine being used in religious ceremonies. And you don't hear about those in the Bible necessarily. But then you've got to think like, well, what was everybody drinking at the time? Maybe the reason we don't hear about that, like, or beer or ale is because it's just so ubiquitous. Everyone is coming into contact with it, from kings all the way and pharaohs all the way down to, the commoners who are just, trying to live or earn a living. everyone is coming into contact with beer. And, you mentioned, of course, like the strong tradition, of, I think in the UK, they've been referred to as like alewives, right? The people who are brewing beer at home for personal consumption. And that being just part of, you bake bread once a week so that you can eat bread or make sandwiches at home. You brew beer once a week so that you have something safe, to drink. It was just such a part of the fabric of civilization. And I do wonder, like, would civilization have existed if not for domestication of cereal grains and fermentation?
Yeah, and that was a question, and I really desperately tried to avoid hyperbole within the book because I thought that would maybe damage my points of view. But it's a really interesting question to go, if we removed beer at any point, perhaps it would be if we hadn't started arable farming for barley, if we hadn't settled because the weather got warmer as we were coming out of the ice age, how much further would we be behind in our evolution as a result of not having beer? And I genuinely think that we would be significantly behind, because as we'll address in chapter 2, so many of the biggest discoveries that were made in sort of the post-industrial revolution and the technological revolution of the 19th century were done by brewers or related. So I think there could be a genuine argument. I try not to make it too strongly, but I definitely personally think that without beer, the world would be significantly backwards from where it is.
Sure, and we're going to get to some of the scientific discoveries right after this break. But before we get to that, right, like the part of the reason why they're able to brew, thousands of liters of beer at a place like Abydos is because of engineering and technological feats, right? And so someone had to come up with a way to move liquid around and to, get the grain from here to there and, process huge volumes of water and grain and all the stuff that we know that it takes to make beer. And at that time, it wasn't all just barley, it was wheat and other cereal grains, and there were spices and herbs and all sorts of different things that went into this. I mean, the sheer technological and engineering feat that is required in order to make beer at scale is pretty impressive, right? I mean, those are technological advancements that probably also facilitated things like vehicles and aqueducts and any of these other modern advancements that we talk about today, like plumbing in your house, may have had its roots in getting water to a brewery to be able to make beer for a religious ceremony.
Yeah, I mean, the example that I use is the pyramids of Giza in the book, which obviously is considered such a technological feat for the time that there are endless conspiracy theories that it was made by aliens. And this is a road I've gone quite deep down as a result of, like my Google history now sends me endless stuff from the ancient apocalypse guy, who, as far as I can tell, is completely mad. But that the argument that I make in the book is that the original Abydos brewery, with its slope sides, with the incredible technology that had to go into it, the incredible organization of people that had to go into it, the learning of that brewing process and the perfecting of that brewing process, these are all sort of engineering, architectural, and technological advances that were 100% then employed about 300 years later to build the pyramids. There's a direct lineage, and Matthew Adams, the archaeologist that I speak to there, draws that comparison as well. He says there is a direct line from Abydos Brewery to the Great Pyramid of Giza, and without that brewery, it's not necessarily possible that the pyramids would have been built. He happens to agree that it wasn't built by aliens.
Well, good. All right, that's good to know. No.
And on a smaller scale as well, the fact that we needed to grow grain for beer and for bread also shaped early tools. It also shaped. I was chatting to a researcher in the field of indigenous beer styles around today, but also historical beer styles and rituals, and we got chatting about how much of an impact early brewing had on the shape of pottery that we find from eras throughout human history. And he was like, there's a whole thesis there that I've never really considered.
Oh, wow.
And he's like, thanks for the idea. And I haven't touched in with him to say like, have you pushed this to anybody, or have you started investigating this? But, the shape of the Egyptian pottery, I think, was very much sharp at the end so that you could dig it into the sand. But it's a conical shape, so it would have undoubtedly also helped with, the settling out of proteins within that beer. So, we don't know exactly what the Egyptians knew or how much they knew, but they got a lot of the calculations correct, either through serendipity or through sheer skill.
Right. And, you mentioned already the cave there in Israel, which is, the oldest recorded, evidence of beer and brewing. And you again, draw parallels to that, right? Is people are brewing in caves and storing these liquids in holes in the ground, right? That they've dug into the ground. And as we started to move out of caves and realize that we could build our own caves, we still need to have places to store our beer, which involved, engineering feats to put, like vats and containers, right? Because you need to contain beer. And so like pottery itself. I mean, again, I try not to be, I'll be a little hyperbolic for you, so that you don't have to be in the book, but you need something to contain the beer, right? It's a liquid, right? It's not like they're trying to contain water. They're trying to contain alcoholic beverages. And that might've been what created initial pottery or initial holes in the ground, and then shapes of bowls and plates and things that we have now. I mean,
and the tools that we needed to create those holes and those shapes and those plates, you know?
Exactly. It's just incredible. And it really, it really does say something about the meaning of beer, right? And the role that beer played in that life. And of course, the beer itself, as we know it, being malt, water, yeast, and hops, I think that came a long time later. But again, making a beverage from fermented cereal grains, I think, is still beer, and that defined so much of early civilization. But another thing that it did, and I think this is something that, of course, I'm very, is near and dear to my heart, being that this is a scientific podcast, is some of those discoveries that you mentioned just a few minutes ago. And so I want to take a quick break, and then when I come back, I want to talk about chapter 2 of the book, which is beer's influence on science. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
How do you feel when you switch to Geico and save on your car insurance? It's like going to work on one Thursday morning and thinking to yourself, just one more day until Friday. But then somebody in the elevator says, Happy Friday! Then you check your phone quickly and discover today is actually Friday. So yes, Happy Friday, random stranger in the elevator. Happy Friday indeed. Yep, switching and saving with Geico feels just like that. Get more with Geico.
The Brew Lab was founded as a way to get brewing science out of the lab and into the hands of people who can use it. And we focus pretty heavily on the science. But one of the reasons that we can dedicate a whole podcast to the subject of beer science is because of the sheer volume of science generated through beer. And so, Jonny, we started by talking about chapter number 1, which refers to civilization. You have 9 chapters in the book, and I want to do justice to those chapters. So I would like to go through each of those, but I do want to start with the one that I think is near and dear to my heart, and also near and dear to this podcast itself. And that's chapter 2 on science. And so what you say about chapter 2 on science is it's how beer spurred us on to new technological heights.
Yeah. So essentially this chapter is the story of, I guess, a couple of main characters, like 3 or 4 men, but also lots of side characters who did a lot of the work before these, much better known or much better funded scientists came along. And between them, they absolutely change not just the beer industry, but industry as a whole. And they're not just industry as a whole, they literally change the world. and the fingers of their research gets into medicine, bioengineering, architecture, construction, all these things that, you know, really exploded, became super important to humanity over the next 100 years, all stem from the discoveries of these few men who were all connected to beer.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and I mean, there's, of course, some amazing examples in there, too. I mean, you mentioned, Emil Christian Hansen as, like, you know, isolating yeast. And I mean, again, visiting the Carlsberg Brewery was something that a place that you went to. And that was one of those things that you highlighted in the book.
Yeah, and I think if I hadn't gone there, I wouldn't have had as much of the context that I really needed to tell that story and make it compelling and contextual and make sense to people. Because, you know, I literally, before I went, I wasn't quite sure why he'd isolated it. And I think it's easy to assume that he was sort of put in the brewery, put in the laboratory, and that was his role. Like, we need to isolate yeast. But the truth, it couldn't be further from the truth. You know, it was a desperate search to save the company because their beer was sick. And it was also, the culmination of some scientific discoveries that have been being made for about 50, 60 years by that point. And really what Hansen did was sort of put a full stop on it and go, you know, done.
Yeah.
And the other really important thing that I got from going there was also the pretty bleak moral tale that is Carlsberg and the remarkable story of the founder JC and his son, who, you know, fell out horrifically, ended up founding rival breweries and spurring each other on, you know, in a horrible way, competing with each other. But that did lead to some of the incredible discoveries that Carlsberg made. So these are all stories that haven't been told fully before, though throughout this chapter, I have to give massive props to Mark Dredge, one of my favorite beer writers, a good friend of mine who did a lot of the groundwork on this and told a lot of the stories from a more technical perspective. He definitely inspired that journey to Carlsberg for me. But yeah, you have to go to these places to understand the human element of that story. And I think with beer, if you remove the human element, then you won't walk away understanding the full story.
Yeah, no, and I mean, the human element is really the key here, right? I mean, the key to the meaning of beer, the meaning of life, how beer built to us, you know, is things like this, right? We wouldn't have penicillins. We wouldn't have, the understanding that we have of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This was a brewer that, I mean, Louis Pasteur first, you know, was the one to identify, even before that, right? Anton van Leeuwenhoek in looking at the microscope, right? I mean, he probably first saw yeast cells. I mean, when he drew them, it looks like little yeast cells. He thought they were, I think, as you mentioned in the book, chemistry, not actual living organisms. But, you know, these are people that are looking at beer. I mean, he's looking at beer under a microscope and making scientific discoveries with a microscope. I mean, these are real people, like, making incredible scientific discoveries because of beer.
Yeah, and I think sometimes those incredible stories get a little bit flattened by the fact that we know so much now, even as, well, certainly in my case, not a hugely educated biologist. Like, I know probably more than Leeuwenhoek ever did just through going to school now. Yeah. But we have to think that, and I talk about this in the book, that before he looked down his microscope, before that incredible invention happened, we had no idea that we were only witnessing a small percentage of life on Earth. Mm-hmm. And from the moment that he looked down that microscope and saw all these other organisms, or not organisms, depending on how he defined them, so many theories that we had about the world and our existence were put on notice. And one of those was literally the theory of creation, because Louis Pasteur, you know, he wasn't the person that first proposed the idea that yeast was alive, but he was definitely the person that sort of the establishment believed and that proved it beyond a reasonable doubt. And by doing that, he didn't just set beer on a certain course. He literally said our theory of creation is wrong. This spontaneous generation, this idea that organic matter can come from non-organic matter, or from the leeches can just suddenly appear in wounds, this kind of thing that to us sounds mad.
Yeah.
But was the only way they could explain it. All of that was put on notice, and that fundamentally changed everybody's worldview when they understood that.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to dismiss that, knowing what we know now and how challenging that must have been to accept for the people around in the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always, every time I hear profiles of, these early scientists, I'm always just blown away. Like, how did you come up with that as an experiment? That's an amazing thing, right? Like, we think of it now, like you said, we take it for granted, but it's really amazing. Like one of the things. Oh, here's another one, and this will tie back. But one of the things that you talked about, sort of getting flattened out, is a history that I wasn't really even that familiar with myself until I read the book. And it's the history of this amazing brewery that is responsible for so many of the modern technological advancements that we have as brewers. And I mean, you could sort of call it like the first in technologically super advanced brewery. And I'm not referring to Anheuser-Busch or, Miller Coors or any of the giant ones. I'm talking about Spaten, which is, you tell the story about the founders of Spaten. And one of the things, not to again spoil it, but to tie it back, is this concept of a hydrometer. And a hydrometer works by displacing water. And that density was because of, which one? It was some Greek philosopher. What is it? Socrates, or I can't remember, but he was trying to show that gold that was painted had a different displacement value of water, and that's how we understood density. And then that leads to the hydrometer, and then we get sugars and control of the brewing process. Anyway, I'm rambling a little bit here. I'll let you jump in and comment.
No, well, yeah, I mean, the story of Spaten, which is, it's owned by AB InBev, and I've said multiple times now that if there's ever a brewery, we talk about AB InBev ruining lots of breweries. The brewery they've done the worst job with is Spaten, because it is the most important brewery in the history of the world, and most people have never heard of it. They might have been to the tent at Oktoberfest, and that's the extent of their involvement with the brand. But this was the brand that built the first viable compressed gas fridge. It was the brewery that, to a very real extent, invented pale lager more than Pilsner Urquell, because they took the British kilns that they discovered on a trip to England and made, the Pale and Märzen, and Anton Dreher went and made the Vienna lager. He was on that trip as well. And then went on, they invented the Helles, and what we consider modern beer was invented, at Spaten, and partly at Pilsner Urquell and partly at Carlsberg. Those three breweries all have their role to play. But we know about Carlsberg and we know about Pilsner Urquell, and very few people talk about Spaten, even though really they kicked it all off. And it was a real privilege to be able to tell that story, to go visit that brewery and to sit in that tower that I talk about in the book and have somebody translate the history of Spaten for me.
I know. It's like, it gives me a little bit of chills too, to think about like some guy sitting there, walking over to the shelf, getting you a pint from the serving area that's up there, which is also already cool in itself. Walking over to the shelf and pulling off this, leather tomed book, as I can imagine, and then reading through the history and annals and talking and, telling the story of this thing. I mean, that just sounds like an incredibly magical experience.
Yeah, I mean, sadly it's not a leather-bound book. It's sort of it's a very, very niche history that was written about 40 years ago of the brewery, I guess by somebody else who was like, why is no one talking about this?
Well, fair enough. That's okay.
But it was incredible, because I speak a bit of German and I translated some important bits. Again, Mark Dredge's book was amazing and I picked out a lot of it. But to have certain passages of it and all of these incredible stories that are told about certainly Gabriel Sedelmar Jr.'s trip to the UK with Anton Dreher, with the hollow walking stick, which people might be familiar with, where they were stealing samples using a hollow walking stick. And all of this seems to be 100% true. And, that those are the exciting things for me, to see these things sourced and spelled out. But even then, not quite given, I think, the incredible context that they needed. And that's what I really wanted to do with it in the book, because Spaten is, I think, celebrated by the people that know about it for the accomplishments it made in beer. But it's rarely been extrapolated out to say, well, without Spaten, there wouldn't have been Pilsner Urquell, and without Spaten, there wouldn't have been Carlsberg. And without those two breweries, we'd all be drinking different beer and probably dying in our millions from infections. So, it all starts with a hollow walking stick and a trip around Europe.
A hollow walking stick, and again, another key piece of this, how beer built humanity, is those places also, as you mentioned, was the first refrigerated storage, right? Refrigeration led to the home refrigerators that we have in our house. You also mentioned in the book Diesel, right? A gentleman who was studying at the time learned how to develop energy for brewing. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think he built an ice machine in Paris under Carl von Linde, who was the inventor, and then went off and did his own thing with the knowledge. It's all these unwritten histories and connections that people haven't made before that are just there in the primary sources. If you
and it's
know
incredible
what we know now.
Yeah, and just an example of how beer impacted science and the world that we know it, right? I mean, the diesel engine had its roots in beer, in refrigerators, right? Refrigeration of beer, which is just amazing. Now, okay, that's a good nerd out on science. There's so many other parts of the book that I want to get to before we run out of time here. But the next one, of course, is probably one that will be unsurprising as well for most listeners. This chapter 3, politics, how beer has influenced the way the world is run. And Jonny, a personal story here. You might be shocked. I was at a local pub here in Corvallis, and I was accosted one night. We were talking about some political things, and I was accosted by a man, and he said, he came up to us and he said, "No, you violated the 2 rules of drinking establishments." And I said, "Okay, I don't know what the 2 rules of drinking establishments are." And he said, "No politics and no religion." And I turned to him and I said, "Those are basically the only 2 rules." Like, how do you not have a pub where you talk about politics and religion?
Yeah, I'd have been sat there going, I don't know how to respond to this without being an insufferable asshole, but literally the reverse is true, my friend.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Like, literally, this is where pubs are. And so, yeah, I mean, to politics, talk about how beer influenced the way the world is run.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a real trend to try and divorce politics from beer, as if that's even possible. It's a heavily regulated alcoholic beverage that was consumed for its nutritional value and was therefore taxed and controlled and looked after by every power that has ever existed on Earth. It is deeply political. And I tell a lot of those stories, and we dig into things like the Reinheitsgebot, which was essentially an attempt to control the production of beer and to tax it right, but also to protect people from bad actors. So it's sort of one of the original food safety laws. Again, politics, and it all came in a rule book. The Reinheitsgebot was one rule in a huge book of rules that was created when Bavaria, I think there were 2 different states of Bavaria unified. So the Reinheitsgebot was a political maneuver as well. And I thought that it was just really important to explain that if you have this beverage that everybody drinks on a daily basis, there's no way that it can be apolitical. And granted, some of the examples that I go for are, extreme examples, telling the history of the Nazi Party, the beer hall putsch, the fact that the first ever meeting of the Nazi Party was in the Hofbräu house. I've stood where Hitler gave his first speech as the leader of the Nazi Party, and I had a pint and a pretzel, not a pint, a liter and a pretzel in my hand.
Yeah.
70, 80 years later.
Yeah.
And I visited the Houses of Parliament and I interviewed an MP, and we talked about the fact that, what did you do after the debate and before the vote was called in the Houses of Parliament? You went to the pub that was on, one of the many licensed venues that are within the Houses of Parliament. Right. And you made your shady deals and your good deals. You commiserated losses. You tried to reach your hand across the aisle, as we say, and make up with people with very different political views. And that was all done under the influence of alcohol. And a lot of people would say that's shameful. Recently in the UK news, it got a story went viral about a councilman drinking in the council chambers of, I think it was Liverpool, the city, and everyone was losing their minds. And I was sat there going, it happens every day in the Houses of Parliament. Have you seen, particularly when there's interviews, when there's debates late into the night in the House of Parliament and they wheel out MPs to get interviewed, they're half cut, some of them. This is the way that our democracy has been run since our democracy was invented.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
And it does a real disservice to political debate to pretend that isn't the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, you've got to think about that. Like political debate. I mean, certainly us as Americans on this side of the pond, when we think about, independence from Britain and the UK and England. Right. We think about one of the best selling brands in the entire United States is a brand called Sam Adams. And that's one of the history. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's a guy who owned a pub and brought together all of these these political luminaries that led to the American Revolution. You know, I mean, the recent Broadway musical Hamilton, right, takes place. I mean, a full third of that musical takes place inside of a pub where they're talking about, you know, just these amazing, you know, foundational concepts for the United States of America, right? I mean, the United States of America. I'm not going to go so far as to say that it was founded over a pint, but it certainly sounds like a lot of the discussions were held over pints of beer, you know. So
absolutely. And you know, it's easy to sort of make a joke of it and be like, oh, people were sort of half cut while they were making laws and this kind of thing, but you know, there's numerous examples in the book of where literally the fact that they were in a pub changed everything, whether it's because they were under the influence or whether it's because of the weight of history of where they were or the comfort of where they were or the people that they met by accident. You know, some of the greatest stories, the greatest accomplishments, the greatest announcements that have ever happened in history have happened in the pub, and obviously some of the worst as well. But beer is something that unites everyone, so it's going to have that positive and negative kind of bent.
Totally. And I mean, and that sort of segues into the next chapter, which is chapter 4 about identity and it's how beer defines who we are as individuals and nations. I mean, this one just struck me as well too, but I mean, of course I'm on a podcast talking about brewing science and Jonny, you're a beer writer, you know, so beer is a crucial part of our identities.
Yeah. I'm sure you get called the beer guy when you're introduced to people as well. Yeah.
Yeah. This guy, he studies beer. Exactly. He's a beer guy. He's a beer guy. Exactly. I get that all the time. But, you know, I mean, independent of that, you know, beer it does define identity. It defines, you know, there's national pride in Pilsner Urquell, or you know, you think about the Belgian pub culture being protected by UNESCO, right, as culturally significant. I mean, yeah, beer has really made an impact on individuals.
Yeah, the example I use in the book, and it's actually one of my favorite chapters because it is one of the most, I think, sort of human, and it's a very political chapter as well. But I talk about the Czech Republic, which is the nation that drinks the most beer on earth, per capita. It's something like 224 pints per person, and that includes women and children. And its entire national identity, and I don't mean this in a flippant or facetious way, is based around beer, because this is a nation whose borders, you know, you could always see the borders on the map, but the actual physical borders never really mattered that much to the Czech Republic. It was constantly caught in the political crosswinds of Europe, and really the Czech Republic was the people, and the people were defined by their language and by the beer that they drank and the beer that they made and the beer that they loved and talked about. And so that's what I tell the story of. I tell the story of Budvar, which is owned by the state now. It was basically kept by this. It was already owned by the state during communist times, and then when communism fell, it remained in the hands of the government because it was such an important identity marker for the nation that if they sold it off, the person that would have bought it would have inevitably been Budweiser, because they've been locked in the longest IP dispute in the history of humanity. And they said, if we don't take this into ownership, Budweiser are going to buy it and probably shut it down so that they get the branding rights. So, you know, I can't think of a better example of how much beer means to a nation than they literally kept a communist brewery that was falling apart at the seams by that point to a very real extent to avoid somebody else owning a piece of their culture.
Right. That's just such an incredible example of identity, you know. But I mean, I think about it too, also, you know, from a very personal perspective as well, too. One of my favorite pastimes is enjoying a beer outside when it's warm out. You know, it's a really a core piece of my identity is you know, going out and experiencing pubs and going out into, you know, to on the lake on a boat or out in, you know, on the river in an ocean or something, and having a beer with you while you're out there, swimming in a swimming pool or something like that for the summer. I mean, those things are core to my identity. Those are things that I love and enjoy, and they define me, right? And that's all because of not because of beer, but beer is a part of it. It's a crucial component there.
Yeah, and I think, everything that you just mentioned there are things that I would expect an American to say. So all of these things that we have as our personal demarcations are kind of true of the culture that we're kind of from. I'm currently working on a campaign within the UK to get Carscale recognised by UNESCO. In the same way that Belgian beer is. And everything that we're doing, and we're gathering this evidence, so much of it comes back to it being unique to the UK, to it being unique to the British pub, and to all of the kind of rituals that you just mentioned. For you might be lucky enough to be in a climate where it's warm enough to go outside and have a beer. For us, that's about 2 months of the year.
Yeah, right.
But the rest of the year, it's fireside pints of ESBs and porters from a beer that's still fermenting under your feet in the cellar. And nowhere else in the world has that culture. They have brilliant beer cultures, but that's ours.
Yeah.
And it's a cliche about the Brits. They like their beer warm. I refute that every single second of the day from a practical perspective. Like, if you think that 10 degrees or, about 50 Fahrenheit is warm, then go have a swim in some water of that temperature. Because we don't drink it much warmer than that.
Yeah.
But it is, it's a marker of a Brit. You're like, oh, this Brit guy drinks his beer warm. It's become a national kind of emblem for us.
Sure. But and that is, of course, chapter 5 also is about culture, and you just gave a whole bunch of examples too about culture, that there's American culture that's associated with identity and beer. And I mean, what you say in the book is or the subheading sort of for that chapter is how beer is a key part of everything from TV to sport, and it is. I mean, there's cultural components to it too. I mean, I think of, honestly, whenever I think of drinking in the UK, I think of two places. I think of pubs, right? And I also think of football matches, and that's where I think of like alcohol really defining culture or being such a part of culture in the UK.
Yeah, and I feel the same when I think about American sport, and I think about plastic glasses of macro pilsners.
Yeah.
And I think of things like Cheers, or so on the Craft Beer channel at the moment, we're doing a series where we're doing sort of deep dives into a lot of the chapters, a bit like we're doing here, but where we sort of tell the behind the scenes stories and the stuff that we experienced, because Brad was with me on a lot of these adventures. And we did the Budweiser episode, and we start off the episode by going, I never thought that on the Craft Beer channel we'd be cracking buds. But the buds that we've got are twist caps, and we do not have twist caps in the UK at all.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I crack it, and both me and Brad sort of look at each other, and we're like, you just feel American twisting the cap off a bottle, because I've just watched it happen in, Friends and Cheers and all of these TV shows where they twist the cap rather than pop it with a bottle opener.
Yeah. What an amazing experience too to hear that from, because it's something I wouldn't think about as an American. I have bottles of Bud and in my refrigerator, and I would go down and crack a beer. It actually sort of annoys me when I have to get a bottle opener. But that's really funny how that that's not only that's an identity and a culture. That's such an amazing point there, and what an innovation, right? The twist off caps, because now Coke and all these other major soft drink brands, and if you're buying a soft drink, it's going to have a twist off cap. I mean, that came from from this industry, which is just another innovation that's just really cool. And so identity and culture so tied up in beer. And then of course, if you've been drinking and you've been watching sport, or you've been out at the pub with your friends, you're going to need something to eat. And so of course that's chapter 6, cuisine, how beer changed what and how we eat.
Yeah, exactly. This is, I come from a food background, really, from working for Jamie Oliver, and so it's always been a topic that I'm asked a lot about when I do sort of press and promo and stuff like that, because of that background. And it's a thorny issue for me, because although I love beer and I love beer and food, I really feel like the beer industry tries far, far too hard to sort of elbow its way back onto the dinner table and displace wine, which has only really been there for 30, 40 years instead of beer. And the way that we do it is just terrible. The winification of beer, I think, is a terrible trend that needs to die a death. So this chapter, I think, might surprise a lot of people. So really, it's about... for one thing, it's there's a lot of things about vinegars, about pickling. It was goodness me, I forget which culture it was that called vinegar beer that wandered into the kitchen, because that's how it was made. You made beer and then you let it go acetic. And then you use that to pickle things, or you use that to season your food. So we talk about that kind of historic element of it. And then we also talk about that debate between beer and wine. And I went to Copenhagen to a very fancy restaurant called Bar, which is now is in what used to be Noma, the world's best restaurant. Where, you know, it's a fine dining establishment, but it has a beautiful pub or bar attached to it, where you can also enjoy the same food. And I sat at the bar and there were 20 taps and I ate Michelin star quality food while drinking pints.
Yeah.
And it was just one of the best experiences I've had. And I think, you know, that's how beer gets back on the bar. And that's how it's consumed in all the nations that do get beer and food right, which is mostly the Czech Republic, Germany, and to some extent Denmark.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I mean, I was just having a conversation earlier today with my colleagues, and we were talking about that exact issue, you know, and I made sort of what turned out to be the unpopular opinion, but I think it's true, is that, you know, I think that you can make a better culinary experience. You can have a better culinary experience with food and beer than with food and wine. And that was sort of an unpopular opinion in my lab, but I think it's true. You know, but, you know, I again, like you mentioned too, like how beer created, you know, how beer created what we eat and how we eat. You know, sitting around a dinner table and drinking over pints and food is just an amazing experience, right? And that's because of something like a beverage like beer, right? That's going to bring people together, that's going to share, and you're going to have this community aspect, which I just segued into chapter 7, which is community, how beer brings people together.
Yeah, so this one was, I guess I was slightly worried about it. You know, there's lots of talk about, in the UK, certainly pubs being the original social network, which is this horrible hacked phrase. But basically, I wanted to tell these stories of how beer has brought people together, but not to do it in a really sort of wishy-washy, misty-eyed kind of way. So what I decided to do is to go to the most isolated place in the world that I could possibly find and see what beer's role there was. And so I went to the world's most northerly pub, which is on the archipelago of Svalbard, about 800 miles south of the North Pole, and went to that pub. That pub was a complete fucking letdown. It was basically the lobby of a Radisson Blu hotel. It was not great, and I wouldn't really recommend going there. But about 50 meters south of that is one of the best pubs I've ever been to. This incredible sort of dive bar with an incredible whiskey and brandy list. Beautiful architecture in there. Photos of all the miners, because Svalbard was sort of a mining community, on the walls. And great beer on the tap from the local brewery. So there is a brewery on an island of about 3,000 people, similar number of polar bears. And actually their tap room is probably the most northerly pub in the world, if you can define it as that. And it's about 20 meters further north. But by the time you reach that, so this is in a town called Longyearbyen, which is the most northerly permanently inhabited town in the world. There are towns further north, but they're only used for research purposes and not all year round. And if you dip your toes in the water, the northern shore of this town, you would be in the most northerly 100 people on earth at that point, which I, of course, did. It was freezing, but I did it. And then I went to the brewery and drank some beers and met the founder, who's a former miner who essentially knew that beer was everything to this community, because there was, you know, even as recent as 30 years ago when the mines were fully working, it was an exclusively male community. It was all men down the mines. It was dark for, you know, fully dark for a quarter of the year and dark for a good couple of months either side of it. So all they had when they got out of the darkness of the mine was either more darkness or indeed nothing but light because of the Arctic summer. So alcohol, food, adventure was all that they really had, and beer was a huge part of that.
Yeah.
And they even, to the point where the government had to limit how much beer you could have on the island because they were getting too pissed. They didn't limit wine because the ruling classes, the officers of the mining corporations drank wine.
Okay.
So they could have as much wine as they wanted, but still they're like, no, fuck that, we want beer.
Yeah, no, we want beer. I'm not going to do that. Yeah.
Or whiskey, it turns out.
Sure, or whiskey, yeah.
but yeah, so he decided to found a brewery after he retired from mining because he wanted that island and that community to have a brewery of its own because of how important it was to that community. So it was fascinating to hear his story, talk to him, and then to see how beer is still absolutely everything to this quite transient community. A lot of different people come and go now because it's research, it's universities, it's tourism.
Yeah, I mean, that story too has happened to me so many times in my life where I've gone someplace expecting it to have this like amazing experience, right? The most northern pub you mentioned, but then you go 50 meters down the road and there's another pub, and that ends up being one of the best experiences that you've had in your life, right? I just that so resonates with me, and I've mentioned it on the podcast before and several times. But one of my favorite trip experiences, I think, would be to just fly someplace, and then when you get off of the airplane, just walk into the local bar and just start asking people, where do you think I should go next? Right? Like, what should I do and what should I do next? And I just think that would just be such an amazing way to just get involved in the community and the culture and the identity of the location. And it would just be a fun place to travel. But it really is amazing. So there in this incredibly remote location on Earth, their beer is found itself, and it was a way to bring the community together and to actually make it possible to mine in that part of the country. Right? I mean, that's pretty incredible that it built that community.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have thought with the trouble that they had with the fact they had very dangerous, serious jobs, you could see why somebody who was in control of that would say, well, no alcohol on the island. But they knew that if they did that, A, nobody would come and work for them, but B, once they did, they'd go mad because they wouldn't have that release that beer offers and that community spirit that, beer creates. And talking to the founder of the brewery, he said that the incredibly dangerous, dark, scary work that you're doing as a miner in those mines really brought you together, but no more than a couple of pints the next evening would as well.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And the beer had to be there. I mean, I think about often, these post-apocalyptic shows where there's like a spaceship that's leaving Earth and, you've got to be one of the people that's on the spaceship. So you have to have a job that's useful. I'm like, hey, yeah, we're going to need beer.
You're going to need a brewer. Yeah, 100%.
you're going to need a brewer. I'll be that guy. I mean, this is, again, I don't intend to do these segues, but they just keep coming out, which is great. But the chapter 8 of course, entertainment. And so, that's, we talk about these post-apocalyptic movies, but how many times is beer featured in movies, right? Or shows or anything. I mean, especially if you're talking about, real biopics of people, beer is almost always in those in some way, shape, or form. But, chapter 8 for you is about entertainment, and the subtitle is, Isn't Beer Supposed to Be Fun?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this was sort of the chapter where I got to let my beer geek escape. So part of the chapter is about a visit to Omnipollo and their church brewery in Sweden, and digging into how they sort of tear all the rules, the rule book apart about how they make beer, what beer should taste like, look like, be packaged like, and try to say that, I've taken beer. I think I opened the chapter by saying, like, I'm not going to lie, there's more Hitler in this book than I envisaged. I've taken beer incredibly seriously for 7 chapters, and this is where we get to let our hair down and go, beer is enormous fun. And we talk about Omnipollo's mad approach to brewing. We talk about Oktoberfest being, the biggest festival in the world. It's not just the biggest beer festival, it's the biggest festival in the world. 8 million people across just, 15, 16 days. It's insane the draw that beer has, and it's like inextricable link to when we go to have fun. Wherever you go to have fun, somebody is probably bringing beer, unless like your idea of fun is driving. So I just tried to tell that story and also to talk about pub games, which is something that's really big in all sort of beer cultures, I guess it would be the best word for it. So I get to tell the story of cricket, which was basically perfected in the pub and was entirely attached to pubs. Without pubs there would be no cricket, and without cricket there would be a lot fewer pubs in the UK. They are just just hand in hand through this incredible story that I tell of the origins of the final rules at a place called Halfpenny Down in southern England. And so it's, it could have been quite a flippant chapter, but I actually think it's one of the more poignant ones because everybody's got these incredible memories about nights out and games they played and places that they went or experiences that they had at things like Oktoberfest, whether it was in the Asian Oktoberfest I went to or the one in Munich, that will stay with them forever. And beer was what took them there, and beer was what lubricated it.
Yeah. I mean, there's two things that immediately come to mind there that I think are personal things that I remember about beer and games and all that stuff. And one of them is this I don't know if you probably know Robin Williams is an American actor. He's now gone. He's passed away, but he was a comedian as well. And he did this one very funny stage rant about Scottish people inventing bowling. And he just imagined like this Scottish guy, standing drunk at a pub and coming up with the game of bowling sorry, golf, not bowling, comparing it to bowling and like how it was way different and all this stuff. And it's just this amazing epic rant. So I'd highly encourage people to go and do that. But the other thing is I have not been to Brazil, but I have a close colleague who lives in Brazil, and he was telling us about this amazing game Truco that they have. And I don't know if you've been to Brazil or if you've played Truco, but the entire point of Truco is to lie to the people that you're playing with. It's about bluffing, and it's about like cheating and stealing and, trying to collect points by doing this. But it's played at almost every beer or bar establishment in Brazil. And so you always, he tells the story, you'll always see these, older guys and families and everyone that plays this game Truco, and it's based on and it's just this amazing bonding experience because you're sort of trying to cheat the people that are across the table from you, but that's the whole point of the game is to like trick them and trap them and get them to do things that they wouldn't normally do, and it's just but it's all based on and wound up in this game Truco, and it's just creates this amazing hours long experience for them there.
I've not heard of that one, but I can't think of a more wholesome way to spend an evening than drinking beer and lying to your friends. Yeah.
Lying to your friends and family, exactly. So that one's a fun one, entertainment, what beer has done for fun, and then the last chapter of the book, of course, is the future, which I think is a fitting end to the book, and the subtitle there is how beer will continue to change and even save humanity, and this one was really cool because there is still. Beer's not going anywhere, and there's still a place for it as we go forward.
Yeah, so the chapter's sort of half about the future of beer, and that takes us back actually to Carlsberg, who had some pretty wild ideas about where beer should or could end up. But being Carlsberg, who have obviously dictated how beer's gone for the last 150 years, you kind of have to go like, well, you might be right, even if I didn't quite agree. And then the second half of the chapter is what I sort of subtitle the momentum of history. So it's basically this story of how our incredibly close and inseparable relationship with beer, and specifically yeast, the yeast that creates it, has resulted in us essentially being reliant on each other for survival. So brewer's yeast was one of the first genomes that was sequenced. It's one of the most adapted genomes that we have in terms of GMO, because it's very malleable. It's incredibly complicated, so you carry it, it's capable of incredible things, but it is a single cell organism, and so it's got this unique place in the world because of what we can make it do using the technology that we have now. So we talk about the incredible uses that we have for brewer's yeast. Things like half of the insulin in the world is created by brewer's yeast. The leading anti-malarial drug is created by brewer's yeast. We use it for all kinds of cancer research because it consumes glucose in the same way that cancer cells do. We're using it to create heme, which is sort of a contingent of meat that we can create sort of ethically using brewer's yeast and then insert into fake meats that might be a way of reducing our meat consumption. And then most importantly, it's used for biofuel. So all biofuels that are created through soy and sugarcane and maize are fermented by brewer's yeast. And it'd be very easy to say beer's not got a lot to do with that. Sure, it's the yeast, but the only reason we know so much about yeast, and the only reason it exists, to be honest, in such large quantities and is isolated and is healthy and is such a part of our lives, is because we've used it for brewing for 13,000 years. And so if beer hadn't been such a large part of our lives, a lot more people would be dying. We wouldn't have the solutions to the messes that we've got ourselves in, or the messes that nature throws our way. And so this sort of momentum of history line came from an interview I did with a really great scientist, at, I think, Cornell, who just said, we're sort of like this snowball, us and yeast, that are just wrapped up and just growing and growing and growing together, to the point where we're completely inseparable. And if you took one away, the other one would collapse at this point.
Yeah, it really is amazing, and we talk about, we've had many episodes on this show talking about GMO yeasts and what the future, holds for there. But that extends to everything, right? It extends to, the better other, corns and crops. I mean, the reasons why we have, you mentioned soy and maize and corn as biofuels and as food sources for people where there's not a lot of food, or where they have, food scarcity. Those are things that became because people were doing research in yeast, right? It extended from that area, which is just incredible to think about. I do think, people, the reason why, that at Carlsberg they wanted to isolate yeast is because they wanted to make better beer, and they had a commercial, reason to do that. But then they isolated yeast, and that led to medical changes and all these other things. Brewers were decently funded, and were able to support research, which is, again, I'll make a plug here at the end too, is like, support brewing science.
Yeah, absolutely, because you don't know where that science is going to end up.
Yeah.
It's not just going to result in better beer, folks. It's absolutely going to result in a better world.
Yeah.
And we have literal proof of that happening with Carlsberg, but also since then, we kind of skipped over Guinness in the culture chapter, but Guinness has been, the impetus behind some incredible inventions and world-changing discoveries as well, just like Carlsberg have been, as well as the incredible cultural impact that they've had through Guinness Book of Records, the incredible advertising and this kind of stuff. So it wasn't just happening in the 19th century. There's 20th century brands changing the world as well.
Yeah, totally. And they'll continue to do that in the future. And sort of as a wrap-up quote, you talk about in the book, is sort of towards the end, you say, just like the effects of alcohol leave no part of our body untouched, so beer has affected every element of our society. And the more we drink of it, the deeper the impact is. I hope this book could be handed to even the most hardened anti-alcohol campaigner, or, God forbid, a wine writer, and they would be forced to admit that without beer, the human world would be a much simpler, much sadder, and much less brilliant place if it were here at all. That's fantastic writing, Jonny, and I think it's definitely a good example of the meaning of beer to us as humans. Now, normally at this point in the show, I would ask if there's one thing that you want brewers to take away from this episode, what would it be? But I'm going to ask a little bit different question of you, Jonny. I'm going to say, since you are a home brewer, you're a host of the Craft Beer Channel, you've got brewing experience. If you had to brew a single beer that stood for the meaning of beer for us as humans, what kind of beer would you make?
So, the obvious answer, I think, would be the Pilsner, because that was the beer that sort of sparked off that technological revolution. The slightly smarter answer would be the Märzen, if I was going to say, actually, I'm going to give more credit to Spaten. But I'm going to say a pomegranate and star anise wheat beer, spontaneously inoculated, single infusion mash in a clay pot surrounded by fire, as the ancient Egyptians did.
That's fantastic. Potentially one of the first beers that was ever brewed, and maybe kicked off the whole thing. I love it, Jonny. Well, this has been a fantastic episode. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and join me in the lab today. Is there anything else that you wish to share that you didn't get to talk about?
No, I mean, we've covered just about all of the books, so all I can say is buy the book, support brewing science, and also support beer writers as well, because as the industry is in crisis and turmoil, so are the people that are writing about it. And without beer writers, I wouldn't have been able to write this book, whether it's Mark Dredge more recently or whether it was ancient historians making their notes on stone tablets. So support beer writers and support beer scientists.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, this book is fantastic. The title of the book, of course, is The Meaning of Beer, How Our Pursuit of the Perfect Pint Built the World. Definitely go and pick this up. It's worth the read. There's so much that we didn't get to cover, so many stories about people and about brewers and their impact on life and the impact that beer had. And so, Jonny, thank you so much for writing the book, and also thank you so much for joining me in the Brew Lab.
Thank you very much for having me and for all the work Brewlosophy do. You've saved me on many occasions.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Thank you. And of course, thank you for what you're doing on the Craft Beer channel. We'll be sure to check that out. And listeners, there will be a link to pre-order the book, which will be out later this month in the show notes. So please take a look at the book. Again, The Meaning of Beer, How Our Pursuit of the Perfect Pint Built the World. All right, next week, Jordan and I will be back talking about the meaning of beer. See y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
How do you feel when you switch to Geico and save on your car insurance? It's like going to work on one Thursday morning and thinking to yourself, just one more day until Friday. But then somebody in the elevator says, "Happy Friday!" Then you check your phone quickly and discover today is actually Friday. So yes, happy Friday, random stranger in the elevator. Happy Friday indeed. Yep, switching and saving with Geico feels just like that. Get more with Geico.